Scott McDaniel. I have Brad Burns here with me. And today we are going to talk about having multiple operating systems or a multiple operating system environment in the CMMC world. And so just a quick introduction about myself. My name is Scott McDaniel. I'm CEO of a managed service provider here in Huntsville called Simple Helix. My background has been, my entire working career has been in IT and telecom, and thrusted into the CMMC world, just like many of you as well. And Brad, introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi everybody. So like you said, my name is Brad. I'm the IT director at Simple Helix. I've been in IT for about 20 years. Large portions of my career have been servicing everything from Linux to Solaris to back in the day with SGIs and IRIX operating systems. And, I'm with Simple Helix now, and sort of like Scott, I got thrust into the CMMC world, just like everybody, I presume, here. So one of the big topics for us that we see with our customers, that we see in our own environment, I, as a Mac user and one of the Mac users that's like cold dead hands, we're very interested in what does it take to bring a Mac, Linux, and those sort of operating systems into CMMC compliance. So first off, the big question is, can you even do multiple operating systems in a CMMC environment?
And so the answer to that is yes, you absolutely can. There is nothing that says that you have to be in a Windows or a Microsoft only environment. There are ways, and we're going to talk about those ways on which you can keep up with Mac, Linux, and Windows all in the same environment. With that said, while yes, you can do that, there is a sort of a universal truth out there that using the Microsoft and standardizing on the Microsoft Windows environment wrapped with a Microsoft 365 environment is like the proverbial easy button. So when people ask, well, why do I need to do just a Windows environment? The answer is because it's the easy button, but it's not the only way.
So when we call it the easy button, what is it that makes Windows so easy in the world of CMMC?
Yeah, so there's a lot of things that come from that. Unique identifiers. So Mac and Linux by default do not have a uniquely identifying key when you create user accounts. Microsoft does. There is centralized device management. So if you're doing your Microsoft 365, you can centralize the user. You can tie that user to their device. That's all centralized through that 365 interface. There's identity tracking. The Windows operating system comes with the default hard drive encryption and things like that. And familiarity. We're going to talk a little bit more about familiarity later on.
Absolutely. So you'll see as we made this presentation, multiple operating system environment is something that is kind of hard to type out every time that you want to type that out. It gets even harder to say, and then it even gets harder to say when you're in front of a group of people and want to say those words all at once. So I have taken the opportunity to coin the acronym MOES for multiple operating system environment. So you'll see me kind of using that throughout the presentation. Just didn't want anybody to be confused by my acronym brain. So when we're talking about the multiple operating systems and kind of that one environment, what all makes it more difficult?
Yeah, so there's two primary reasons why running multiple operating systems in a cybersecurity compliance framework difficult is, one, it makes the compliance effort just more complicated. And whenever you make anything more complicated, that also means it becomes more expensive. So to kind of talk to the complexity side of it, as we all know with CMMC, you have to write the system security plan, or that SSP. When you introduce multiple operating systems into the environment, you now have to write controls and how you handle the objectives for each operating system. So if you have 3 operating systems, you now have to answer each objective 3 times. All of that just adds more paperwork to the process. It adds more planning, because now we have to keep up with the 3 different operating systems. And then the audit itself becomes more complicated, because the auditor no longer gets to just come through and say, hey, what are we doing for this one objective? We now have to say, hey, we have to do that for each individual operating system for those that are in scope. And then on the cost side of it, it is more consulting, because again, you have to write more around your SSP. You have to define what the multiple platforms are. You have to take the time it is to do all of the prep and everything that goes with it.
Yeah, absolutely. When we're thinking about, hey, we've got to go down this path. We have multiple operating systems in our environment. What things can we start thinking about that, if we want to start mitigating kind of that more mentality, more complexity, more cost, and that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so one of the things that we see a lot at Simple Helix is when anybody does try to go for their first, anytime they do any compliance framework, not just cybersecurity, but even, quality management, things like that, is that the nature of human, when we start trying to put our hands around the effort, is that we try to scope everything in. And so when you try to scope the whole business in, it does drive up the cost, drives up the complexity. And so one of the things that we try to do right off the get-go is try to shrink the scope, try to get what not necessarily has CUI on it out of the scope of what we're trying to do. And then within that, there's a couple technical solutions that once we kind of get past hey, we don't need to bring the whole organization, we don't need to bring every single PC in, we can actually compartmentalize what is in scope, then it leads to the next part. So you want to talk about those?
Yeah, absolutely. So our scoping, once we've scoped out, whatever we don't need from, or whatever does not to contain CUI, then we take what does contain CUI, and we roll that into like an enclave, right? So we create kind of the sectioned off piece of our environment, and that's the part of the environment where we process, store, transmit CUI data. The other piece, and this has been a really popular thing as customers have come to us, is virtualization. And we've had a few customers come to us and say, hey, so we have these Mac OS devices in our environment, and here's how we want to try to get around the CMMC thing, or bringing our Mac OS devices into our compliance scope, is we're going to still run them, but we're going to toss a Parallels or VirtualBox or something on top of that, and we're going to run a Windows OS, and then that Windows OS will adopt it in our 365. So early on in the CMMC process, there was some controversy about, is this the right way to do it? Can this be done? We at Simple Helix have come down on the side of it's really best that you don't try to go and do that, because your auditors are going to come in, they're going to see you've got a Mac OS that you've tried to write out of scope, but a little bit of it is in scope. And what they're going to see, we think, is that Mac OS device, their judgment is going to say, nope, that Mac OS device, just because it has a VM on it, it still is going to be processing CUI. So where we have been transitioning customers is going and using the Azure Virtual Desktop space. Many of our customers already have a 365 GCC or GCC high tenant, And we've been working with customers to, take that same mentality of let's virtualize and let's take that as what we want to bring into compliance, but moving it from the OS device up into the Azure VDI environment inside of their GCC high tenant. And finally, so as we spoke about their cost and complexity, a lot of that cost and complexity can be a result of having a Windows, Mac OS, Linux, whatever other operating system environment, and supporting all of those multiple OSs in your world. So if you have a space, if you have an environment where you can go all Mac OS, that may be something to do, right? So kind of go all in or go home, right? So, maybe instead of supporting a hybrid environment, maybe you've got a lot of users that want to do Mac OS, and you can just go all Mac OS and then provide that one singular solution that you write your SSP around and you buy the platforms to support.
Yeah, so to kind of talk about that a little bit more. So if you're intent on doing that, right, you're going to go all in, some of our recommendations on how to go about doing that is basically go get your ducks in a row is kind of the universal theme that we say around that. Get used to the idea that you need to get ready to build your justification. Because we're going to talk about it again a little bit further down the line, but there is going to be some challenges that auditors are going to be very familiar with Windows. They're not going to be maybe not necessarily as familiar with Mac or Linux. So you need to be getting ready to justify your position around that. You need to know what data is being used, where, why, and what that data is on. So, what we're talking about here is you need to build that Linux lab because you want to use the Linux operating system to do your software development, things like that. It's totally okay to do that. Again, we're building that justification. We're building the container around that lab. We're trying to get our hands around what is happening with those Linux PCs. We just need to make sure that we understand what it is that's going on those PC. Understand that you got to count the cost of doing that. So the days of, hey, again, if I just use like the Linux lab example, it's hey, we could go spin up Linux. We can do all this stuff for little to no cost. There's still going to be some cost element around the compliance of that, even though Linux is open source. And then, of course, it all comes back to the document. The more documentation that you have that describes that environment, the better off you're going to be.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. If you have your documentation straight when you're coming into your audit, it's probably going to be your single most valuable tool. When that's true, if you're running a homogeneous Windows environment with 365 and GCC high, having your documentation straight is absolutely essential. But when you're looking at the multiple operating systems, your documentation becomes even that much more valuable in that audit situation, because you maybe folks sitting in this room are going to be part of the auditor or the audit, answering questions. That's going to be a very nerve-wracking situation for a lot of us, right? We have auditors kind of crawling around all of our stuff. They're judging. I mean, it's their job to judge. So they're coming in, they're judging kind of where we're sitting, what we're doing. That's stressful in and of itself. But, if you have done your homework and as you walk through this process, if you've done your documentation, you're going to just take that much more stress off of your life. So now we've talked about kind of all the reasons why not to do this, which is sort of irony for everybody sitting in this room, because presumably you guys are, interested in running multiple operating systems in your environments. So the way we kind of framed this next part of the conversation is how do we do what Windows does, right? So We talked earlier in kind of the earlier part of our conversation here. We spoke earlier that, hey, Windows is the easy button. And then we kind of listed through a few reasons why we think of it as the easy button. So we're just going to contextualize the rest of this conversation in terms of, let's take each of those points. Here's what Windows does well, and kind of break them out into practical examples of how we would approach it.
Yep. So, what you'll see is, what would Simple Helix do in the next set of environmental elements? So the first one is, what does Simple Helix, what do we do around identity management?
Yeah, so when we're talking about Mac OS, we've spoken that there is no native identity manager in the sky. There's not really an Intra ID as it was that's just native to the Apple ecosystem. So what we would do as practitioners of in the IT world is we would go to something like a third-party Okta solution. There's also Jump Cloud out there that is a good mature solution. But our kind of, I guess, preference, I guess you could say, would be to go and leverage an Okta solution. And the reason is because of maturity, but they offer that centralized database, right? So that centralized database, the real value there is it enforces the unique IDs. So we all know that the NIST and CMMC, they want every one of your users to have a unique ID. Right. So the reason that we centralize that, of course, is, in the case that you have a couple of Mac users, their Macs are in scope, right? And it's like Dina Barnes and Derek Barnes on two different machines. And they go set up their individual Macs, they add their user accounts, and they both become D Barnes on their Macs. And that's not something that's sustainable to track through the CMMC world. So we want to go with an Okta or a Jump Cloud solution that we centralize those and force the unique IDs. We can authenticate our Mac logins with these tools, and that gives us the ability to track these users inside the Okta world. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that Microsoft, they've got a product that I believe launched in June. Nobody quote me on that. And we'll edit it out of the film, that is called Microsoft Platform SSO. And what they're looking to do is to bring that kind of Okta functionality into the Mac OS world. The asterisk is beside it because I have not personally tried it. I've not set it up. I've not really done anything except kind of read some white papers about it and stuff like that. So, but what they're looking to do is basically just get that Okta piece in there. Today, I wouldn't go wholeheartedly into that solution, even though it does, if you already have a 365 environment, it does kind of wrap that up with the rest of your hybrid environment. It's less mature, and I can't sit up here and say this is going to be a reliable solution.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that we do continue to see happen as time goes on. So when we started this journey in the CMMC for us, that started in 2019. There was just this huge divide between the Microsoft world and the Apple world, and we continue to see that Microsoft tries at least to start playing a little bit nicer with the Apple ecosystem, and so there are advances that keep happening in Microsoft 365. So that does look a lot different here 5 years later. They'll kind of speak to Brad's point. It's still not fully mature. So if you think you can go do like the Microsoft 365, fully, think you can just do the Entra part of it or the Azure Active Directory if you're still not comfortable with calling it Entra. There's going to be some limitations there that are going to hiccup the path to success. And then, hey, what about the Linux boxes?
So I'm not sure what sort of flavor of Linux that folks use in this room. I know it can be religious, and so I'll apologize now if anybody's a Red Hat person, but I just happened to be kind of on the Debian thread, and that led me to Ubuntu, and I've been using it for quite a while at this point. And one of the more exciting things that Ubuntu has released, they did I don't want to call it a preview, but in their 2304 release, they did add some native integration to the Azure AD, now Intra, for the workstation authentication. That module, so under testing situations and very lab, academic, if you will, environments, it works reasonably well. And to authenticate your users, to do some permissions handling. And the addition is you are able to kind of integrate that into your 365 environment, so you can track those users' authentication to their workstations, to the SharePoints, to everything else, kind of in one place with your Ubuntu environment.
Yeah, and I would say, kind of speak to, obviously there's multiple flavors of Linux out there. Eventually you got to get to the point where, you can't let every single engineer have exactly the, particular flavor that interests them on one given day. And so, for us as an MSP, what we're trying to do is we're trying to figure out, hey, what's the most popular place to be that covers the biggest amount of audience, right? And also prevents the least amount of barriers. So if you are looking for that, like, hey, what is the most common area or what the most common flavor to land on that, actually has expertise with people really trying to get a Linux box truly into compliance. For us, we've jumped on that Ubuntu bandwagon.
Yep.
What about, now it's kind of switching gears, about policy enforcement, right? So one of the great things that comes with Microsoft that we've all been doing for years was GPOs, now just policies. But how do you do policies with Mac OS?
Yeah, and so again, we don't have that native environment from Apple, or for Linux for that matter, for enforcing the policies. And, when we're talking policy enforcement, we're not only talking about baselining, right? So there's this idea of having a system that when you bring a new workstation on board, it provisions it, it installs the policy, it installs the software, that kind of stuff. That's a huge part of it. But we're also talking about the enforcement of these policies, not just kind of that baseline, because what we don't want to have happen is spend our hard-earned time and money developing a whole bunch of policies, loading them into the system, only to have it just go out, reach out to the machine one time, push the policies, and then for the next 12 months of the year, rolling up into your CMMC audit, that machine and that user are having, they're living their best life now, installing, all sorts of stuff and skewing it from your baseline configuration. So the Mac go-to for from our world is Jamf. Everybody who, has used a Mac in a corporate environment, especially kind of a DIB, a DoD environment, probably is very familiar with the name brand Jamf. And that familiarity comes from that they've been doing this for a while. Their singular focus is Mac. They have a very mature platform, and the way that you approach compliance in Jamf is very much you roll it out, you baseline it, but Jamf also will go enforce those policies and make sure that you don't get configuration drift as your users kind of go out and do things. A big thing with Jamf, and we're not sponsored by Jamf, but Jamf, if you're listening, bring on the money. But they've got this compliance reporter tool that will allow you to set your compliance policies up in Jamf, and then they have basically this reporting tool, much like what we're familiar with Intune and Intra and Purview in the 365 world, that will tell you how your Mac fleet stacks up and what policies are applied to them, and then where they rank on your compliance. And then large support community is a fantastic thing to have as well. So the runner-up, of course, is Intune. Intune started adopting Mac support in 2015. They started it. You could adopt a Mac into it, and then they kind of stopped for a while. And it's been a very kind of slow growth since 2015. Over the past 12 to 18 months, the Microsoft engineering team has very much been putting a lot of effort into kind of upping their support for Mac OS within Intune, but it's still lagging behind things like Jamf. By and large, I would say that Jamf, being the mature model, you can rely on it, and every time that you want it to do something, it's going to go out and do it, right? So yeah.
And then double tap there,
Oh, sorry.
but then for the Linux boxes.
Yeah, so there is a plethora of tools out there that will work with your Linux environments. My favorite actually happens to be Ansible. I very much, I'm a supporter of Ansible. I've used Ansible all over the place, from Linux to I've configured firewalls with it. I'm a huge Ansible supporter. But when it comes to compliance, where we have to know that those policies are being pushed out, they're being maintained, my go-to for that is going to be the Puppet, and it's going to be the enterprise version of Puppet to get all of the features that you need to actually go and enforce the rules. So this has those features. It limits your configuration drift. It keeps your machines in a compliant state. And of course, just like Jamf, one of their main things is they have this comply tool that also gives you the ability to look at the adoption of your policies across your fleet, monitor and keep track. Which, as we develop the policies and we roll into our audit, this is going to be something that's crucial as we're stepping into it in our worlds.
And then kind of switching gears a little bit, one of the last big challenges that we interact with quite a bit when it comes to the compliance around multiple operating system is the requirements for tracking the users, right? Where are they? What are they doing? How do we keep up with that? So for us, we actually kind of go a little bit different on this one. Normally, up to this point, we've been putting a technical solution in for every step of this, but this one's where we kind of differ a little bit. So Brad, you want to talk about that?
Yeah. So this one, as we were talking about this, about this conversation, this one got a little, I guess not out of hand, but just there's so many different variables in a Moz environment, right? Of, how have you got it scoped? What flavors of Linux are you running? If you have Mac OS devices that are being used to develop on, or are they being used as contract machines? There are so many different variables, so many different technologies that companies and organizations can use to build these Moz environment that we, actually came down on, very much recommending talking to a SOC partner. So a SOC partner, of course, we would expect that they would have a SIM tool. They would have 24/7 monitoring of, the logs that come in. They would have action alerts, that kind of stuff. But the critical piece here is to work with a SOC partner who will come alongside you, look at your environment, and help you build a solution that can centrally track, that logs everything into a unified situation, so that you can track that user who logs into his Mac, that then goes and logs into the SharePoint to go and access the CUI data or ITAR data. And this is such a critical piece of both security in our environments, but also in our compliance, that, Scott and I would absolutely, look at a Linux box and say, hey, we know, 16 ways to do that. Let's get Logstash. Let's put an Elastic server. We can run it in the basement. We're all good. But this is such a critical piece of your auditing and your compliance journey that we're not sure that it's, or we're sure that we should recommend talking to a SOC partner when you have a complicated environment like a Mo's environment.
And in full transparency, we at Simple Helix, we actually had grand ambitions as an MSP to actually start providing SOC service. And because we kind of had this thought, oh, cool, all we need to do is go get a SIM, we'll partner with an EDR company, we can go stitch this together. As we went down that road, the complexity when there are multiple operating systems and trying to track those multiple operating systems back to kind of like Brad said, hey, I'm trying to track that this guy's on the Mac and he's logged into the company SharePoint site and now he's trying to do this from this place and that place. I mean, if you guys have ever played with a SIM tool, I mean, it's just a lot of information. And so when you finally get to a paid service with the SOC around it, they've already figured out how to filter out the noise. They've already figured out how to build the correlations. There's a lot of time and energy they've already poured in it. And then, so there's kind of no point having to reinvent the wheel when they've already got the wheel. And so for us, we even stepped out of the SOC business and said, hey, we're really good being in a swim lane around MSP. We love doing technical uplift. We love, making policies and doing all the things, but that 24/7 piece and trying to correlate all this stuff back together. Hey, well, there's a swim lane for that. Let those people be in that swim lane and just let the SOC service do it. And so for us, we just go, hey, this is one of those times not to put just another piece of software or another technical solution in here. Go get a service to handle this one for you.
Yeah, absolutely. SOC service is hard. It's a hard service to go and build. It's a hard service to operate. So if you guys have a SOC service that you subscribe to that you like, go find them and buy them a drink because they're good folks doing a hard job.
All right, and then next topic is around encryption, right? So we started this conversation that going to that Microsoft 365 GCC high environment, hey, everything's going to be encrypted. You get that Windows professional laptop, you can go turn on hard drive encryption. It's there. It all handles. But what about like the Mac and the Linux boxes?
Yeah. So this one actually is kind of straightforward. So Windows has the BitLocker capabilities. Mac OS File Vault. So File Vault, as we all know in the CMMC world, if it's going to be encrypted, it's got to be encrypted at FIPS 140-2. And the Mac File Vault does meet those standards. They've got your Apple Silicon covered. Both of our solutions that we recommend as far as configuration management, they can enable, they can enforce, and then they can keep a secure backup of the File Vault keys kind of safe, so that when a user inevitably locks themselves out or whatever needs to happen, you have a copy of the keys that you can go to the rescue. So back to the Linux side, with the Ubuntu Canonical relatively recently dropped a Pro subscription that you can subscribe to. With that Pro subscription, they do provide FIPS 140-2 tools for your environment. And when you subscribe to Pro, you'll have access to a repository. So you add that repository, it's just an apt install for that repository, and it brings down the FIPS tools. And you can go and leverage your Puppet to both install it, but also configure the FIPS per your SSP.
All right. And then the last topic is around just familiarity. And what we're talking about there is when the auditors actually show up, how familiar are they going to be with your IT environment? So
So we all know that Windows runs the world, right? So the government's already running on Windows. More than likely, when your auditor shows up, or all 7 of them, however many that you happen to get lucky and get, they're going to roll in with their Windows 11 Pro machines, and they're going to go and check their email on Outlook and access their documents on Microsoft 365. And basically their entire world is more than likely going to be a very Microsoft Windows-centric world. So when they come into the environment, that is homogeneous, it's all Windows, it's all 365, that auditor, they're going to know where to look because they probably looked there 100 times as they've been auditing other customers. They're going to be familiar with, oh, hey, so show me where you're doing this control. They're going to be familiar with watching you go, okay, let me log into the 365 admin. Let me click here. Let me go here. And then there's the control. What we suspect they're not going to be as familiar with is as you're building these support platforms for your Mac OS environments or your Linux environments, they're not going to be nearly as familiar with, hey, let me see where you guys, so in your SSP, you call this policy out. Let me go see where you've implemented that on your Linux fleet. They're not going to be nearly as familiar with going into your Puppet enterprise solution and looking to see where you've set password complexity or whatever it may be. Honestly, I don't know that there's actually a substitute for that. There's no technical substitution that you can add other than documentation. The thing that we all love and adore is building your documentation out. One thing that we did talk about in this is whoever is going to be sitting in front of the auditor as kind of your main question answerer, be sure to take a moment and prep your question answerer, right? Yeah. The last thing that you want to do is kind of have somebody just sit down and start answering questions and they really don't know, they don't really know anything about the environment. So make sure that you have them prepped. Is there anything else just from a auditing perspective?
Yeah, so what I was going to add on to that one is like when we at Simple Helix, when, we started making these CMMC baseline configurations for like the Microsoft 365, we got crafty and we were like, when we create our documentation, we're going to create, we're going to grab the URL that drops straight into the Microsoft 365 admin portal. You're going to get to see that the password policy has been set and you're going to see it in real time. Like this is going to be like the greatest thing ever. And as we went through our first couple of JSVAs, next thing the auditor goes, well, that's really cool and everything. Can you give me a screenshot of that? And we were like, yeah, but you're seeing it real time. Like it's better than a screenshot because you don't necessarily know when the screenshot is taken. And they were like, yeah, but we still need to see a screenshot. And so when you do get into the Mac side of the house and Linux side of the house, and you know that there are going to be less technical or less familiarity with those technologies over the Microsoft, kind of to the Brad's point, these auditors, they'll been in Active Directory servers before. They'll know what, the tree structure looks like with the yellow folders and all that stuff, but, they're not necessarily going to know what the Linux looks like or what Jamf looks like. You might get lucky, you might not, but the big piece there was just screenshot, build the documentation. It's on your shoulders to be able to explain how you got to where you are and that, yes, you really are addressing the intent of that objective or that control. And so it really does become, unfortunately, your burden to document everything that you're doing with the other operating systems because you can't just assume that the auditor that you're going to get is going to be completely familiar with other operating systems. And unfortunately, it's the popularity game with regards to that. All right. So I think we kind of ran the extent of all of the topics around the multiple operating systems. Brad and I, we're going to hang around here and we're going to kind of end this just a little bit short. So if you guys have questions for us, come see us. And then when we get kicked out of the room, Brad and I, we can go take the conversation out into the hall. But would certainly love for you guys to come talk to us. If you don't find us back in the South Hall, Simple Helix. We have a booth there. We'll be hanging out there the rest of the day as well. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.